They use economic, finance, trade and other sanctions against Russia as a weapon, which now are affecting the Europeans and the Americans themselves.
Russia is under severe economic sanctions imposed by Western countries, but are they working? Hello, I'm Einar, and this is The Heat. Russia has become the most sanctioned nation in the world. More than 6,000 sanctions have been slapped against the country over the past few years, including individual Russian political leaders and businessmen. Russia exports have been banned, banks have lost access to international systems, yachts of oligarchs have been seized, and many companies have left Russia altogether. Western countries hope the financial pressure will force President Vladimir Putin to de-escalate the attack in Ukraine. But how much economic heat is Russia actually feeling? And can it backfire? CGTN's young Shanshan begins our report.
The conflict in Ukraine has prompted far-reaching financial sanctions against Russia, from plunging the ruble and freezing foreign reserves to dropping Russian investments and kicking Russian banks out of the SWIFT system. The escalating measures are starting to take their toll.
The purpose of sanctions are clear: restricting Russian capital financing for military expansion and economic regulation. The sanctions indeed squeeze Russia's economy, but we believe Russia can still tolerate them. Russia is a major exporter of big commodities. It has rich natural resources, particularly oil and gas. It's also a major exporter of grain and corn.
As the conflict continues, there might be still room for further sanctions, but the global economy has already paid a price. The sanctions were designed to avoid disrupting essential energy exports, which Europe relies on to heat their homes and power their economy. But surging oil and gas prices are affecting European consumers. And with large exposure to Russian financial systems, many European banks may see loan defaults and suffer losses. The Russian military operations in Ukraine and the wide-ranging sanctions imposed on Russia have injected huge uncertainties to the economic decision-making. The outcomes remains to be seen, and the conflict has added to the challenges faced by the global economy recovering from the COVID-19 pandemic. Yang Shanshan, CGTN, Beijing.
To discuss these sanctions on Russia, let's bring in our guests from Moscow. Pavel Felgenhauer is a defense analyst and columnist for Novaya Gazeta. From Beijing, Einar Tangen is a current affairs commentator. John Quelch is dean of the Herbert Business School at the University of Miami. He joins us from Florida. And here in Washington, D.C., Brian Becker is the executive director of the Answer Coalition. Welcome to all of you. Pavel Felgenhauer, as I said, Russia has been targeted with very severe sanctions, but President Putin says the country is going to be able to withstand these economic pressure. Let's listen to what he had to say.
It's clear that the current events are drawing a line under the global dominance of Western countries in both politics and economics. Let me stress, the obsession with the sanctions by the United States and its supporters is not shared by countries where more than half of the world's population lives. It is these states that represent the fastest growing, most promising part of the global economy.
So, Pavel, does President Putin have a point there? I mean, he points out that these sanctions are not shared by countries where more than half the world's population lives. What is your reading of how the sanctions are impacting Russia and how they will impact Russia in the future?
Well, the sanctions had an immediate and devastating effect in Russia. Things will get worse. Of course, the Kremlin is putting a brave face on it, and Russia will not collapse under these sanctions totally, but well, the toll is going to be very, very serious. Economists say maybe up to 10% loss of GDP only this year. And they're simply things are disappearing from the consumer goods, not only consumer goods, because it's not only sanctions per se, but also a large number of Western companies and international corporations pulling out of Russia, logistic companies not supplying supplies. I mean, well, say just simply a printer paper right now is risen, and price of it has risen 8 times, and it's disappeared too. So there's sudden things disappear or become much more expensive all the time right now in Russia. Something is in the same price, something is 2 times, 3 times, 4 times more expensive or disappears entirely. And this is going to be a serious effect. Of course, Russia, let's say Russia will survive. Russia's major trading partner is China, and China is not imposing any sanctions. Well, India is also not imposing sanctions, but trade with India is much smaller. But that's also, of course, important. Israel is not imposing sanctions on Russia, and Turkey is not, and Serbia is not, say. But so that means that Russia will get some kind of way to the world markets, will get things, but a lot will have to adjust, and it's going to be a very painful adjustment.
What about basic commodities, Pavel, things like stuff in grocery stores?
Well, basic commodities are more or less there. But again, there are problems because, say, it was all connected. It's a connected world. So right now they say they're going to import fertilized eggs of chicken from Chile, because from Europe they're not coming in, or Turkey. I mean, it's grown here, but the fertilized eggs are imported, and a lot of other things. I mean, that are not like. I mean, yes, Russia is producing and exporting a lot of wheat. But the wheated plants, also it comes from abroad. It's international. And international shipping companies are not taking actually orders to Russia right now, things that are not under sanctions at all. So it's a serious situation, and the prices are going up dramatically on many items.
John Quelch, what are your thoughts on how these sanctions have been formulated and how they are being used against Russia? I mean, these are some of the harshest sanctions that have been imposed on a single country. Do sanctions work?
Yes, they do, but it depends a little bit on the degree to which the target of the sanctions is willing to roll over in the face of the sanctions. And obviously, Mr. Putin is very determined not to be forced to the table as a result of these sanctions. So I would say that they are having a very, very substantial effect. The purchasing power of ordinary Russians has been compromised heavily. And when that purchasing power is compromised by the collapse of a currency, it of course means that the affordability of imported product, and as has been mentioned, a lot of consumer products are imported into Russia. Those are then less and less affordable. So the impact on the daily lives of Russians is very substantial. On the other hand, as we know, Russia is a supplier of very important commodities internationally, not just energy products, but also palladium, titanium, nickel, other very important commodities, all of which have rocketed in price on world markets due to the uncertainty. And to the extent that those commodities are still being exported by out of Russia via counter trade or via third countries that are not part of the sanctions regime, the people who are exporting them, the companies exporting them, are actually gaining higher profits per ton of the commodity than they would have done before the sanctions were imposed and before the war broke out. So there is still a tremendous amount of commerce that is taking place. That's not necessarily commerce that's affecting ordinary Russians, but it is fueling a continuation of the Russian government and enabling it to fund its military efforts.
So, John, would it be fair to say that, yes, the sanctions are having quite a serious impact on Russia, but they are also having an effect on the rest of the world, especially industrialized countries?
Well, it varies again, of course. In the U.S. is almost self-sufficient in energy and has a number of energy reserves that can be brought into play as soon as the price of the pump hits $4 a gallon. Obviously, a certain number of oil wells in Texas suddenly become viable again. So the United States, from an energy point of view, although it imports around about 8% of its energy from Russia, is nowhere near as dependent, of course, as Europe. In addition, America has, as has been stated, many multinational companies that are risking assets or revenues by closing down or pausing their Russian operations. But in most cases, the percentage of revenues and profits involved is a very small number, a single-digit number, and so the hurt is not that great. And it's worth pointing out that, of course, these companies, including European companies, have paused operations. They have not unilaterally and permanently withdrawn from Russia, obviously hoping that a resolution will occur soon and that business can be reopened.
Brian Becker, as I said, Russia is now the most sanctioned country in the world, but the United States is threatening even more sanctions. Here's the White House spokesperson. Let's listen.
We have implemented more economic sanctions than we have on any other economy in the world. There are additional individuals that can be sanctioned. We can have new targets. We can deepen the severity of sanctions on existing targets. We can further eject Russia from the international economic order. We can further deny Russia the capacity to modernize and diversify its economy, like we have with the export controls and the cutting off of access to a lot of technology.
So, Brian, as President Putin pointed out in the introduction to this show, the majority of countries in the world do not support sanctions. In fact, they far outnumber the countries that do support sanctions. We have a map right now. Those countries that are depicted there in blue, and you can see they're North America, United States and Canada, then Europe, then Australia, and then Japan. Basically, those are the countries that support sanctions. The rest of the world, that huge mass of white there, are countries that do not support sanctions. So can the United States carry out these threats?
Well, yes, the imposition of these extreme sanctions shows, as Putin sort of rightly said in the address that you played in the beginning of the show, that what we're witnessing is a demonstration of the extreme dominance, not just in politics, but also in economics and finance by Western countries, and in particular by the United States, which is orchestrating this effort to isolate and freeze and sanction Russia, to deglobalize Russia essentially just in a matter of a few days. And it does show the extreme economic power. And it's important for our audience to recognize that when the U.S. invades Iraq and hundreds of thousands of Iraqis die, there are no sanctions on the United States, or if the U.S. and NATO invade Afghanistan, no sanctions on those countries. This is a very selective instrument of political pressure on certain parties and certain entities in certain countries, and it's performed almost exclusively by the countries that are now supporting U.S. sanctions. The rest of the world, and that's the bulk of humanity, which has been actually suffering from these kind of sanctions, and it's all over the Middle East, parts of Africa, certainly Latin America, they may not approve, they probably don't approve of the violation of Ukrainian sovereignty, but they certainly don't go along with the United States imposing sanctions on Russia, because this is a weapon used by the powerful against the less powerful. And I have to also remind our audience that Russia, between 1918, a year after the Russian Revolution, in 1991, or certainly in 1987, was the most sanctioned country in the world, and it was also compelled to be the most self-reliant country in the world. It has big spaces and lots of resources. I agree it's going to have a very bad impact and a lot of suffering for Russian people, but it won't cause the Russian government to collapse, and it won't deter their war plans or their strategic security demands from the West regarding Ukraine's entrance into NATO.
Einar, Tangen, of course, China is not going along with these sanctions against Russia, and this appears to be of some concern to the White House here in Washington. And we know that President Xi and President Biden will be holding talks on Friday. But this is what the United States Secretary of State Antony Blinken had to say on Thursday. Let's listen.
We believe China in particular has a responsibility to use its influence with President Putin and to defend the international rules and principles that it professes to support. Instead, it appears that China is moving in the opposite direction by refusing to condemn this aggression while seeking to portray itself as a neutral arbiter. And we're concerned that they're considering directly assisting Russia with military equipment to use in Ukraine. President Biden will be speaking to President Xi tomorrow and will make clear that China will bear responsibility for any actions it takes to support Russia's aggression, and we will not hesitate to impose costs.
So, Einar, what are we to make of these threats that the United States is now leveling at China? This is a war at the moment that is between Russia and Ukraine, Ukraine being supplied with weapons, logistical support, other support by Western nations. China has not gone along with the United States on these sanctions, and we hear Antony Blinken say, if you don't do as we say, we will impose costs.
Well, this is part of an ongoing effort to vilify China. I mean, the reality, as you pointed out, that this is a contest between Russia and the United States over the expansion of NATO, about security concerns that Russia has. The Ukrainians are the innocent victims here. And the U.S., having caused this problem over the long term, and this does not justify the invasion of Ukraine, is now saying that China, who it vilifies on a daily basis, is responsible for cleaning up the mess that the U.S. created. So, I mean, this is another example of where American soft power is dying a slow death of 1,000 hypocrisies.
And what are we to make of the fact that the United States is now seeking help from China, yet if we look at United States policy over the last few years, it's been very hostile towards China. It's slapped tariffs on China, for instance. And we just heard today that there are reports that the United States is planning on building a missile battery, which is on what is off the coast of China.
Yeah, this is that kind of continuing, ongoing pressure. I mean, China's success over the last 40 years represents an existential threat to the U.S., which has not had success, although it believes that it has the best system. Internal divisions within the United States, politically and economically, have resulted in the blame game. Who's at fault for everything that's going wrong in the United States? Why aren't we on top? I mean, these are the questions that voters are asking, and it's very easy for politicians to say there's an evil force out there, and it is China. This Russian situation has changed the focus somewhat, but you once again see hardcore Washington China hawks linking these two issues. It's very strange. I mean, I have a fight with you, so I shoot everyone around you.
Pavel Felgenhauer, there was a piece written in the Washington political newspaper called The Hill. It was written by 3 analysts, and they say that sanctions will actually strengthen President Putin because it would force the country, Russia that is, to develop domestic production and actually hurt the countries that are imposing more than it does Russia. Do you agree with that?
Well, yes, that was the official line. I mean, since the sanctions began to be imposed on Russia, mostly after 2014, after the reunification with Crimea, they have been countered by Russia to replace foreign components, foreign materials and stuff in high tech and try to make our own. Well, that works in some places. It can't work universally. The kind of North Koreans, the chuche they call it there, total self-reliance, well, doesn't work even for a country as big as Russia. It didn't work good for the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was much bigger and had also a lot of allies attached to it, 2 times bigger than Russia is today in terms of population and potential. So it will work in some cases, in others it won't. Russia will have to cooperate with the world if it wants to develop high-tech things. You can't really, we had an industry in the Soviet times, say, to produce special steels for different space, military applications. Now we're not producing them, most of them, because producing, say, 2 tons of steel a year that's commercially unviable. It's a kind of special steel. There are thousands of different specimens of such steel. And it's not only steel. There's a lot of things that you buy on the world market, and if you're cut off from the world market financially and logistically, and by sanctions imposed, you're in a lot of trouble. You can try and do something like, say, Iran is doing. They're making their own drones. They're making their own rockets. They're getting some things they buy in other places. Of course, Iran is not as high-tech as Russia, which inherited a lot from the Soviet Union. But still, it's kind of, well, second tier. So, of course, in the long run, Russia will have to find a way to accommodate its relations with the West, because the West it's not only America, it's also Europe, which right now is very much behind these sanctions and actually taking sometimes the initiative, because the Europeans see themselves as more threatened right now by the situation in Ukraine. We'll have to find some kind of a quid pro quo with the Europeans. That's also understood.
John Quelch, when we talk about how sanctions work and whether they work, I'm reminded of the sanctions that were imposed on South Africa during the apartheid era. These were pretty stringent sanctions that were imposed on the white minority government at that time. In a certain way, it actually made South Africa self-sufficient in some very important sectors, like the energy industry. It developed a system where it extracted oil from coal and was able to meet its domestic demands for energy. It also developed its own arms industry and became a major exporter of arms to the rest of the world. So I'm wondering, when we look at that Hill report, which says this could strengthen Putin, what do you make of it?
Well, being under threat is always a motivation to become self-reliant. And one of the great values of global trade and global investment flows across borders is that, to a great degree, they do help to preserve peace and guarantee peace. But what we have seen in the last 8 weeks is a lack of attention to those considerations, and a geopolitical issue trumping economic considerations and the welfare of ordinary people in both the Ukraine and in Russia. I think one comment I would make on your South African analogy, coming back to the engagement of multinational corporations, is that during that era, many multinational corporations, of course, did boycott trade with South Africa. But some corporations took the view that they would stay the course and try to work to help the situation from the inside. And that's actually true at the moment in respect of Russia, because there are significant multinational companies that have not joined the majority and come out saying that they're going to exit.
One other quick point, John. You were talking earlier on about Russia's oil exports. The United States suspended oil imports from Russia, but the United States imports almost nothing from Russia in terms of oil. So will it make much of a difference to Russia?
I think the key problem that the U.S. has is the alignment with Europe, because under President Trump, of course, Europe and the United States did not get along. President Trump had a few choice remarks for Europeans which were not that pleasant. Biden has tried and succeeded, I think, thanks in part to this invasion of Ukraine, in bonding the U.S. and Europe closer together. But Europe, of course, depends 40% natural gas and 27% oil on Russia. The United States is in the single digits. Getting alignment between and maintaining alignment between Europe and the U.S. on energy sanctions, especially as we have now blown through all of the easy sanctions and are now confronting the ones that really represent the tough choices. This is where the rubber is meeting the road.
Yeah, Einar Tangen, we heard some reports over the past few days that China's payments for oil from Saudi Arabia will now be made in yuan, not in United States dollars. And there are also reports that India is considering a rupee-ruble deal with Russia. I mean, what impact will this have on world trade, and especially the dollar as a reserve currency?
Well, absolutely, very, very significant, and especially later this year, you're going to start to see the digital yuan come in, which makes it even easier and cheaper to do transactions. Remember the internet offers efficiency, and that's how these vast fortunes are made. They're able to reduce costs and take a very small portion, but very large numbers. So at this juncture, the U.S. dollar is in peril. The U.S. has continually kind of pushed these ideas, but they're kind of boomeranging back on the U.S. And unfortunately, I would say the same thing about Russia. I mean, if Russia was concerned about NATO, unfortunately, these moves have given NATO a new lease on life. So when you start looking at these things, it's antithetical. I mean, Russia can go back to a bare bones economy, and unfortunately, the sanctions are a sieve because there are other countries who can supply.
Brian Becker, listening to the White House and to the media here in the United States, one is led to believe that it's the United States that holds all the cards in this dispute, in this conflict right now. Is that the case?
Yeah, the U.S. is feeling very strong because the uncertainty or differences of opinion within Europe over expansion of NATO into Ukraine have, for the moment, been eviscerated as a consequence or as a response to Russia's military operations. Yeah. So at the moment, the U.S. feels like it's back at the top of the heap. Yeah. But I think this is a fiction and a bit of a fantasy. And you listen to Anthony Blinken, the way the Secretary of State is talking to China, with all of these bullying expressions and you better get in line and you better do what we say. I mean, this doesn't sound like a really confident government. It sounds the way a bully on a schoolyard sounds when they have to demonstrate and show everyone how big and bad they are. I think the rest of the world is very resentful, and this isn't the American century. Maybe the beginning of the 20th century, maybe they thought of the Pacific as an American lake, but those days are done. Yeah. And so I think what we're seeing here, the Biden administration is failing at home. Its Democratic Party couldn't deliver anything in spite of their new slogan. So they're using Russia really and China as a punching bag, hoping that the American people don't notice that the real problem is at home. And by the way, your other guest said when you pay $4 at the tank at gas stations, well, that's already happening. In California, it's $6 a gallon. Yeah. I mean, Americans actually are suffering, and we're in a volatile economic situation. I think the U.S. feeling like it's at the top of the heap is, again, a fantasy and sort of an expression of American exceptionalism for days bygone.
Okay. Einar Tangen, I've only got 10 seconds, unfortunately, but are you expecting much to come out of that telephone call between President Xi Jinping and President Biden on Friday?
No, I'm afraid not. I mean, with the kind of tone that's been taken, there's not much room to do anything other than express a desire for diplomacy.
Okay, and that's where we have to leave it. That's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for watching.